Hi all, welcome to my channel Data Wisdom. Today we are going to see how do we use Normalize Component into AbInitio. So Normalize Component is present into transform folder of component library, and it generates multiple output data records from each input data record. Okay. Normalize can separate a data record with vector field into multiple individual records, and each record will contain one element of the vector, and how many number of records we will be generating per input record, that is defined into length function, which is available into normalize component. So the parameters available into normalize component is transform, where we'll be writing our business logic. Reject threshold, again it is like every other component, we'll be having three values into it: about on first reject, never about, use limit and ramp function. About on first reject will fail our graph as soon as we receive our first rejected records. Never abort will never fail our graph irrespective of the number of records which are being rejected into our graph. And use limit and ramp value, this will accept several number of rejects into our graph based on the formula. Okay, now let's go to transform parameter of normalize and see what we can write. So we have a function called length into normalize transform. Okay, so what this length function does is it determines how many number of time an input record will be looped into normalize, so that it can produce that many number of output records. Okay, and based on the value of this length for that input record, the normalize function will be executed and it will generate multiple output records. Now first, before understanding this, first see our input data. So into my input file, I have customer ID, number of transaction, and then a transaction vector. Okay, so for this customer ID, number of transaction is 2, and I have two elements into this vector. First is transaction date 1994-03-23 and the amount. The second transaction date and amount for this customer ID. Similarly, for this particular customer ID, I have three transactions done. So I have respective transaction date and transaction amount, and similar are the other records. Okay, now what I want to do, I want to generate a flattened record. I do not want my output record to be into vector format. So my output, I want customer ID, transaction date and transaction amount. Okay, so I should have two records for this customer, since into this vector I have two elements present for two different dates. Similarly, for this customer ID, I should have three records. Okay, so as we have discussed, what we'll provide into length function, we can directly provide this column value. So I know how many number of records have to be generated. Okay, let's go to normalize. Let's see the length function. Into length, I have directly assigned the entrance column. Okay, and now what I am doing, for every vector based on the length, if the length is 2, the index would be 0 and 1. If length is 3, index would be 0, 1 and 2. So I am picking the values of transaction date and transaction amount based on that index. Okay, so first record length is 2, index would be 0 and 1. So index 0, it will pick first transaction date. Index 0, it will take the amount with respect to that particular date. Again, it will call the normalize function again, since we have not reached the complete length. Now it will loop for index 1. Similarly, for second record, it will loop 3 times based on the length. Okay, now let's see. Let's run the graph and see what output data do we get. So into our input file, we were having 4 records. Into our output file, we have 8 records. Now let's view the data. We should have it in a flat mode. See, for customer ID 2142, we have 2 records with separate transaction date and transaction amount. Similarly, for customer ID 3213, we have 3 records. Okay, so whenever there is a requirement where you are getting data into form of vector and you want to flatten it, go for the normalize component. Otherwise, whenever a requirement comes to generate multiple records out of one record, you will have to use normalize component, and you will have to write your length function accordingly. Okay, thank you.